Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rabbi David Kosak of Congregation Neve Shalom in the beautiful Pacific Northwest here in Portland, Oregon. And as people slowly enter, I am so grateful that you are joining Israel360, Stand With Us, and Lahav, Harkov for an important conversation about the recent Israeli elections and related issues. Israel360 is a program housed at Congregation Neve Shalom, and for the past half decade, we have been hosting and putting on programming, robust programming featuring a wide lens on Israel's politics, its culture, its arts and food scene. And the 360 in our name refers to our fearless pursuit of the truth and openness to discourse from all perspectives that is all entertained with a sense of respect and with a sense of curiosity as well that allows us to enjoy the culture of Israel from a diverse set of perspectives, but also allows us to engage deeply with the topics and concerns of the time. So I'm very grateful that you are here joining Israel360. We're partnering today with Stand With Us, and it's really a pleasure to have you, Randy Kessler, here with us. Stand With Us, for those unfamiliar, is a global nonprofit organization, and its mission is to support Israel. It does so through education. It fights anti-Semitism. I should add that it's a nonpartisan educational organization, and as such, they don't support or oppose any Israeli political leadership, but they do educate about politics, and so this program today certainly falls in to that perspective. In a related vein, neither Stand With Us nor Israel360 are this conversation today. The views espoused by Lahav are her own views. They don't represent either of our organizations, but are representative, again, of our commitment to really hearing viewpoints from across the political aisle as well. So Lahav, it's so wonderful to have you here. For those of you who may not be familiar, she is a senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post. You've had an amazing career. You were a reporter at the Knesset for a period of time. You are a voice to report what's coming out of the Prime Minister's office, the National Security Council, Foreign Ministry, and more. So you are definitely an individual who has her pulse on what is happening in Israel. And an area of concern for many of us, of interest and curiosity as well, are the recent Israeli elections. For those of us less familiar with the Israeli parliamentary process, even after the elections, it's not always clear who the ruling government will be because a coalition has to be assembled. So we're hoping that today you'll be able to give us a little bit of the lay of the land, where things currently stand as Bibi Netanyahu attempts to assemble a coalition, concerns, issues, points that we as American Jews committed to the Zionist enterprise would be well advised to learn about. And I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you so much for having me here.
Absolutely.
And I will get into what's going on in the coalition talks. So I want to just sort of rewind a little bit to explain how the sort of elections work in Israel, how this system of coalition talks work before I talk about what's actually happening, just because people are, it's so different from the United States that people are not so familiar. So first of all, I think the thing that people need to understand is that when you vote in Israel, you vote for a party and not a person. This time there were about 36 parties that ran. Usually something like 10 to 12 parties get into the Knesset, and the way you decide what gets into the Knesset or not is parties need to get 3.25% of the vote. Once the votes are counted and you know who's in the Knesset or not, the seats, there are 120 seats in the Knesset, and they're divided up proportionately. And then the leadership of the different parties, they go to the president to recommend a candidate for prime minister. And whoever has the most recommendations is tasked with forming a coalition, and throughout Israel's history, that person has always been prime minister up until 2019, when we had this cycle of 5 different elections. I'm going to move forward to what we're going through right now, but if people have questions about that, I will be happy to answer why we had so many elections in the past 4 years. Usually the person who's prime minister is the head of the largest party, or the person who's tasked with forming a coalition is the head of the largest party, and that's the situation right now. It's Benjamin Netanyahu. His Likud party has 32 seats. But it doesn't have to be, and so there have been cases where, say, the second largest party has only like a couple seats fewer than the largest party, and they still got more recommendations. That has only been the case basically for Netanyahu, but it's legal and it's fine, and it's happened a couple times. The next step in the process is that the presumptive prime minister has to negotiate with other political parties in order to form a majority. No party in Israel's history has ever had a majority on its own. The party that had the most seats ever was Labor, with 56 seats in the early 1970s. That's before the Yom Kippur War. Arguably, they have never politically recovered from it. But back then, they only needed 5 seats to complete their coalition. 5 more seats. Whereas Netanyahu, his Likud has 32 seats, and he needs, at this point, it's like he'll have 3 other parties in his coalition, and that's been the norm. Mostly parties, the largest party has been under 40 seats, often significantly under 40 seats for at least the past 20 years, but even before that, since the mid-90s, I would say. So now Netanyahu is in these negotiations, and just in very broad terms, when you have these negotiations, they take place on 2 tracks. Which portfolios people want. So in Israel, the cabinet posts are not professional, they're political. Arguably in the US, they're both. But in Israel, you'll often have a situation where someone will be health minister who has no expertise in public health. Whereas in the US, you usually have, it's a public health expert who also supported the president or advised the president on those policies. In Israel, it's like anything goes. Legally, you can appoint someone who's an expert and who's not a politician, but because it all comes from these negotiations through the parties, it doesn't happen that often. And then the other track of coalition talks is on policy matters. They usually come up with a document called the coalition guidelines, where they talk about what they want to promote, what they want to do in their, up to 5 years in office, or a little less than 5 years, but the average is actually 2.5 years. But it tells you what their plans are. So we are at that point. Basically from the point of election night, or maybe the next morning, it was very clear that Netanyahu had a solid majority. Netanyahu and the parties that said they would support Netanyahu had a solid majority, so he actually started negotiating right away. But he was only officially tasked with forming a coalition yesterday. Yesterday was when President Herzog made that announcement. So we are pretty deep in the negotiations right now. Maybe I should get into who he's negotiating with. So he's negotiating with 3 other parties. They're all religious and right-wing parties. In Israel, when we talk about right-wing or left-wing, and this is in very broad strokes, but usually people are talking about how much concessions people want to make in land to the Palestinians, right? The further you get to the right, the fewer concessions people want to make, the further the left you get, the more concessions you want to make. And this usually tracks with other policies, the right being more socially conservative, the left being more socially liberal. It doesn't necessarily track with economic policies, which I will probably touch on. But certainly on social and religious, the way people talk about right and left in the US, it somewhat tracks, even though it's not exactly the same. So the parties that supported Netanyahu in the election and recommended him to the president are all the religious right. 2 of them are Haredi parties. There's an Ashkenazi Haredi party and a Sephardic Haredi party. They choose to organize themselves that way. There are some minor differences, but for the most part, for the sake of what we're going to be discussing, they overlap. Like they have a lot more in common than they have not in common politically. And then the third party is the Religious Zionist Party, which is made up of 3 different parties. I would argue they are the far right in Israel, including one party that's considered very extreme in Israel, which is Otzma Yehudit, the Jewish Power Party or the Jewish Might Party, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Presumably, that's the party you've been hearing about since this election, because there has been a lot of reporting on them in the foreign press as well, and a lot of understandable concerns coming from American Jewish organizations. I mean, I could say that I've spoken to other organizations and other synagogues, and there's a lot of concerns. So I think we'll get into the negotiations, and then in terms of the negotiations, you'll understand what each party cares about right now. So with the portfolios people want, sometimes, I mean, everyone has their policy priorities, but sometimes it often is about the prestige of the different portfolios more than anything else. But the policies, I think, are coming up, are what's interesting. And one thing that all of these parties that are negotiating with Netanyahu that have in common is that they want judicial reform. So Israel doesn't have a constitution, but in the early 1990s, Israel passed certain like civil rights laws that the court then took as almost having constitutional weight. And if you pass laws that contradict those laws, then they'll strike the new laws down, saying it contradicts those laws. The right the truth is that the Likud passed those laws at the time and had no issue with this when it first started happening. But in the past decade or so, the right in Israel has begun to have more of an issue with it. It's become a right-wing cause. Interestingly, way back 30 years ago when that law was passed, it was Labor who thought that this would be problematic, but things change over time. And the truth is that there's no law, there's no sort of like regulation out there that explains what the balance is supposed to be between the legislature and the judiciary. No one ever gave the judges permission to strike down laws, but it's a question of just political sort of what you think the court should be doing, what you think those civil rights laws mean in Israel. And so the Israeli right thinks that the judges are taking on too much authority and that they have no check on their authority, whereas the left thinks it's important that they should have a lot of authority to be a check on the legislature. So the right at this point wants to pass a law that's called the override clause. I imagine in Seattle there's a lot of Canadians, so some of you might be familiar with this because it comes from Canada. And basically way back in the Pierre Trudeau days, when they passed their own civil rights laws, some of the provinces in Canada said, well, this contradicts certain laws that we have, and we want to be able to maintain those laws. And so they created a mechanism by which you could vote to keep a law on the books, even when the court strikes it down. My understanding is in Canada, this has been invoked only like a handful of times. Over the decades. Pierre Trudeau's been out of office for a very long time at this point. But in Israel, this law exists in a very limited way. Basically, one of those civil rights laws that were passed in the early 90s said that you can have whatever occupation, career that you want, that you can't be sort of discriminated against based on who you are. And the Shas, which is one of the Orthodox parties, which also wants to be in this coalition now, at the time, they proposed a law that would explicitly prohibit, no, sorry, I'm explaining it wrong. At that time, the court struck down the law that prohibited raising pigs in Israel. And Shas basically was going to bring down the government over it. They were like, we don't want to be in a government that allows people to raise pigs in the Holy Land. And the Supreme Court president, which is like the Chief Justice, came up with this compromise, which he brought in from Canada, and it was passed in a very narrow way. So it only applies to this freedom of occupation law, occupation, as I said, referring to your job. The right wants to expand it. And everyone has different reasons for wanting to expand it. And there's a reason I got deep into the weeds of this kind of wonky issue for you guys. This is a huge issue for the ultra-Orthodox party. So it's very interesting because people talk about it. Netanyahu is on trial for various counts of alleged corruption, and people talk about it as like a Likud thing, that Likud wants to undermine the court. But interestingly, the Haredi parties want this because there are two laws that the court overturned in recent years that they would like to bring back. One is their exemption to the mandatory draft in Israel, which actually the court overturned, I believe, in 1999 already. And then there's been all kinds of like temporary stopgaps, things to lengthen it, different experiments. But the court basically said a few years ago that like none of those things are satisfactory, and it's still a discriminatory legal situation that Haredim who study Torah all day are exempt from serving in the military. So they want their exemption back. The other thing is that not only are Haredim, if they're studying full-time, exempt from the military, but they actually receive a monthly stipend from the state. It's not a lot of money. It is, in most cases, less than what a soldier receives. But I mean, they're not equivalent to a soldier in any way. So they want those stipends back.
I thought
and they want them to be higher than they
Didn't
were.
they want them doubled or something?
They want them doubled because it's been like
something.
Yeah, because it's been like 10 years or something since the amount was changed. And yeah, so interestingly, like the Haredim, they never liked the Supreme Court because they like ideologically didn't like the idea of a Supreme Court that is not a Beit Din, but they weren't so involved in this issue. This was sort of a secular conservative issue for a long time, or religious, maybe someone in terms of like settlements and things like that, so that people who are pro Judea and Samaria feel that the Supreme Court was very much against them. So but now it's become a Haredi issue as well. So this is a big thing that's being talked about right now. Yes, Beit Din is a Jewish religious court. In Israel, there's Jewish religious courts. There's also Muslim religious courts. They generally deal with family law. And in some cases, you can choose which court you want to go to, secular or religious. Just since I already mentioned the Muslim religious courts, I mean, there was a time when it was a big American like political discussion about like Sharia courts, yes or no. And then I would always shock people by saying like the Israeli government funds Sharia courts, but they're not doing, they're not ruling that people should have their hands cut off for stealing and things like that you might have heard on like Fox News or who knows what was going on at the time. It's they're ruling on divorces and wills and things like that. That's what religious courts do in Israel. So back to today. So that is actually a big thing in the internal discussion of what Israelis are talking about with this coalition talks. The courts are a huge thing. What Israelis are maybe not talking as much about, but are of concern to American Jews, is that all of these three Orthodox parties that are negotiating with Netanyahu, they all want to really narrow the sort of who is a Jew question that sporadically, perhaps too often, comes up in Israel. So one of the things is, in Israel, in order to be allowed to make Aliyah to immigrate to Israel, you have to have at least one grandparent who's Jewish, which is that you might not necessarily be considered Jewish under halacha, under Orthodox Jewish law. But the secular law in Israel still allows you to move to Israel, even if you want to get married when you're in Israel, the rabbinate will give you a hard time and probably not let you if you're not halachically Jewish. They want to narrow that down. They want to take away what they call the grandfather clause, and they want to make it only if you have at least one Jewish parent can you make Aliyah. And then the other thing that, and this actually somewhat relates to what I was saying about the courts, is that, 30 years ago already, more like 34 years ago already, the Supreme Court ruled that conversions from any Jewish denomination count for purposes of making Aliyah. So conservative, reform, reconstructionist, however you convert to Judaism, that's good enough for the Israeli Interior Ministry, which is good enough for you to immigrate, even if once you get here, the rabbinate thinks you're not Jewish, you're Jewish enough to move to Israel. And also a few years ago, the court ruled that if you're not Jewish, you come to Israel on a visa, and then you convert to Judaism, say in a reform, through a reform rabbi while you're in Israel, that also has to be recognized. So that's sort of newer. It's not a case that actually comes up that often, but it was a recent Supreme Court case. And these parties don't want that anymore. They want only Orthodox conversions to be recognized. Now, again, these are things that have been of concern to American Jews who are following the news. My sort of evaluation of the situation is, I mean, obviously this would be like this would cause a huge crisis between Israel and the diaspora, I think. And a lot of the crises that we've seen, I think, would seem very small compared to this one, because this is really undermining what diaspora Jewry, and more American Jewry than others, but sees as who Jewish people are. But I think that Netanyahu understands that. Not only Netanyahu, some others in Likud as well.
Can I push back on that a little bit? Because certainly for those of us in the non-Orthodox world, we are familiar over the years with many commitments that Bibi Netanyahu made to the non-Orthodox streams, which he then was quite happy to rip up when he had pressure from his right-wing partners. So
absolutely,
all the platforms at Robinson's Arch, agreements around all of this. So I guess I'm wondering, what gives you a certain comfort in assuming that the fact that he is aware that this is an issue would actually translate into action if if like most politicos, his desires to remain in power and to maintain a stable coalition?
I agree, and then I also when I wrote about this, my caveat was he's going to have a lot of difficult demands from this coalition, and he's not going to be able to say no to all of them and still keep his coalition alive. I think arguably this undermines like the ethos of Israel as the homeland sort of for all Jews around the world, and as a refuge for Jews around the world. And I think that is important for Netanyahu and important for some of the religious Zionists who are more moderate. And so I just think that's like that's going to be more meaningful than, say, the Western Wall is meaningful, right? But anyone can still go to the Western Wall, even if it's in a way that doesn't make them necessarily comfortable. And so I think that this is like an escalation. But you don't, there's certainly, I have no certainty, let's put it that way.
Oh, no, none of us.
I don't think anything's going to happen with the Western Wall compromise in terms of like, actually convening the committee that was promised of reform and conservative rabbis to manage the egalitarian section. I think it's going to continue to be, sort of not properly looked after, and occasional like Orthodox extremists like coming in on the holidays and things like that to try to block other people out, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah. So I want to shift back because you did talk about Otzma Yehudit, and without a doubt, a lot of us have concerns about Itamar Ben-Gvir. I'm wondering if you sort of share what you view as happening in Israel that push Otzma Yehudit into this position, and particularly among younger Jews who are surprisingly supporting and supportive of Ben-Gvir at a higher level than other age demographics in America. Because I know we know it in America, we know it in lots of places in Europe, Hungary, of course, famously, but there does seem to be a shift in zeitgeist and in some attraction to some form of highly authoritarian, that's the nicest way I can say it, sort of leadership. What's happening in Israel and among the young in particular that see us this shift in support of Itamar?
So I do think there's two things happening at once. I think like on Israel, it's not, exempt sort of, or it hasn't escaped the global trends towards right-wing populism. And so you see it in a whole bunch of European countries, and for a while in Brazil, and for a little while in the US as well. And and so Israel's just part of that global trend. But I think that what's unique to Israel is that Israel has been trending strongly to the right for 20 years now. The left has been in decline. It had a few times, a couple times where it sort of peaked a little bit again, but Israel hasn't had a left-wing prime minister really elected since 1999, since Ehud Barak. That's the last time the Labour Party won an election. And I think a lot of it has to do with like I said, people define right and left in Israel by sort of how they relate to the conflict with the Palestinians. And it has to do with failures of left-wing policies to bring peace, right? Oslo, like 2 days after it was signed, there was a bus bombing, and that started a huge wave of big major bus bombings. Ehud Barak offered 97% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem to the Palestinians, and the Second Intifada started like a year later. Ariel Sharon, not a left-winger by any means, unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, and we've had thousands of rockets from Gaza since then. And so I think that when people look at that and they see certainly Oslo and Ehud Barak offering all that land to the Palestinians, those are signature policies of the left, and what happened right after, that certainly began that trend. I think part of the trend is also demographic. Israel has a very positive, birth rate beyond the rate of replacement. The average is 3 children per family, but the more secular you get, the fewer children you have, broadly speaking, and so the more religious you get, the more children you're going to have, and religious Israelis tend to the right. So those are two things that I think are happening. In terms of Ben-Gvir specifically and this election, so, a year and a half ago, we had Operation Guardian of the Walls. Hamas was shooting rockets into Israel, including at Jerusalem, and the IDF, struck at rocket launchers in Gaza. But what was different about this round with Gaza than really any of them before it was that there was rioting in mixed Jewish Arab cities. And it's a small minority of Arabs, but still in these cities, Arabs burned down a synagogue in Lod. They burned down Jewish businesses in Akko. They actually lynched a Jew. They pulled him out of his car and killed him on the streets of Akko. And there are Jews who also fought back against Arabs and things like that, but it was a deeply traumatic experience. And, these are all communities that are underprivileged, and they felt that the police completely ignored them, only showed up when it was much too late. And the thing is, politically, what was happening in Israel is this was in the middle of a coalition negotiation after election number 4 out of 5. And like a week later, a government was formed, and it was like the government and everyone just moved on to the next story, and who didn't move on and who tapped into this fear and resentment that a lot of people felt? Itamar Ben-Gvir. Frankly, Netanyahu was prime minister when this happened, so they don't necessarily feel reassured that Netanyahu is helping them. And Ben-Gvir was paying attention, and he really figured out how to capitalize on that. He claims to have the answers in the way that extremists always claim to have the answers, and they're not necessarily very practical answers, and he might be hit with the wall of reality very soon. What he wants right now is to be the public security minister, which is the minister who's in charge of police, which will be very interesting because the current chief of police in Israel, police is a national institution. It's not like city by city. So the chief of police in Israel a few months ago called Itamar Ben-Gvir like one of the greatest inciters of violence in Israel. So it'll be really interesting to see how they will be able to work together. But also, Israel is a country with rules and laws that are generally very carefully kept to, and the public security minister can't just tell the chief of police what to do. So I think that even if he gets the job he wants, the reality will be it'll be very interesting.
So what's the mood on the Israeli Arab street, going from coalition partner to this new, I mean, we're still in a, forming this coalition, but clearly that has changed. It doesn't look like the government that's going to form is going to be more hospitable to concerns about increasing public expenditures and infrastructure in historically more impoverished Arab neighborhoods. Where's the Arab street right now in Israel?
Yeah, so I'll start with a little bit of background. So politically, since 2015, there was what was called the Joint List. So before that, there were usually 3 different Arab parties that ran in the Knesset. And, Arab is not a political position. So you had Arab communists, which usually had like 1 or 2 Jews running with them, but it was a mostly Arab party. There's the Islamists who are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, but they are actually very socially conservative. And you had the sort of extreme Arab nationalists, who the founders of their party, it's called Balad. The founder is actually a fugitive from the law because in the 2006 war with Lebanon, he gave Hezbollah information about where their missiles were landing in Israel. Just so you understand what I mean by extreme Arab nationalists. They all very much support a Palestinian state. Most of them have some sort of affiliation with Palestinian parties in the Palestinian Authority. And they all tended to be very, very focused on the Palestinian issue. And so they don't get along very well, but they decided to run together in what was called the Joint List in 2015, and they actually did very well. And then sort of in the subsequent elections, it was like on and off, like would they let their infighting get the best of them, or would they run together? When they run together, the whole is worth more than the sum of its parts. But before the 2021 election, one of the parties, Ra'am, which is actually the Islamist party that's affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, they decided that they need to focus on domestic affairs, that they hadn't been doing the things that their constituents need. Part of this has to do with the fact that in recent years, there's a huge spike in crime and gang violence, especially in the Arab sector. It's become really bad, worse than it's ever been. And so they wanted to have a seat at the table to make sure that attention and funds would be dedicated to this issue. But also, when they didn't have a seat at the table all these years, it has an influence on how funding is allocated to infrastructure, to education, to all kinds of things. So this party, Ra'am, was in the last coalition, and the coalition had allocated actually a lot of money to them. It was supposed to be over the course, it was a 5-year plan. But when the election came along, you look at polling and reporting on the Arab Street and things like that, people weren't satisfied that they didn't see results yet. Now, I mean, this is a government that's been around for, it was a government that was only lasted a year and a bit. So, I don't know what people expected, but it was a really bold and sort of unprecedented move by the Ra'am party. And so I guess the voters, on the one hand, the voters did pay them back. They are the biggest of those 3 Arab parties, which, by the way, all 3 ran separately this time, and only 2 got into the Knesset. So on the one hand, it did pay off. But on the other hand, the voting rate among Israeli Arabs was pretty low. And the explanation people give is, like, first of all, there's this split of whether they want to actually cooperate with the government or not. And second of all, that they were disappointed, that they thought that they would immediately see some kind of improvement. Now, with this government that's being formed now, there's definitely a lot of concerns because of, well, we didn't mention about Itamar Ben-Gvir, which is sort of surprising because it's sort of the thing people know about him. He is a disciple of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who, of course, was an extremist rabbi in the US, and then he made Aliyah and brought extremist views there as well. And he, at the time, wanted to basically forcibly deport all Arabs out of Israel. He eventually was not allowed to run for Knesset. Some of the laws were changed to ban him from running for the Knesset, such that if you incite to racism, you cannot be a candidate for the Knesset. And some of his disciples and his students have been banned from running over the years as well. Itamar Ben-Gvir he's a lawyer, and he's been careful enough to say just, to go just as far as he can without being banned from running. And he now says, oh, I am not exactly like Kahana, I'm more moderate. And the truth is that the diehard Kahanists are mad at him. They're a very, very tiny group of people. And so he talks about only deporting disloyal Arabs, people who support terrorism, etc. So, I mean, what does disloyal mean, right? Like it's
in the eye of the beholder to some degree, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So, it's not very comforting to Israeli Arabs that he says he's not as extreme as Kahana. And frankly, like Kahana was somebody who, saw traitors everywhere, and Jews who weren't as extreme as him, he saw them as, not as Jewish, or just didn't care as much about the Jewish people. And I feel like Kahana trying to push these, exclusionary policies that wouldn't let a lot of Reform and conservative Jews come to Israel or live in Israel, is in that vein.
Israel McCarthy, yeah. I forget which editorial I read, but it was an interesting perspective, because I think many of us are quite concerned with the extension of Otzma Yehudit to a very powerfully leveraged coalition partner, as it looks like. But one of the editorials said that there were, with all the upset and outrage against Israel and concern with his ascension, that he only garnered 10.1% of the vote, or
something like that, yeah.
Something like that. Whereas Marine Le Pen, in a similar political perspective in France, got 41 or 43% of the vote, and no one's crying out loud about France in the way that,
Yeah, that was Bret Stephens.
Oh, that was Bret Stephens. Okay.
Yeah, and I thought in some ways that was a good column, and in other ways I felt like he was missing the point a little bit, because like Marine Le Pen lost, and that's it. So she doesn't have any power, and Itamar Ben-Gvir is going to be in the government now.
Yeah, no,
better comparisons might have been to, I don't know, Germany or Sweden. I'm pretty sure in Sweden, the extreme right ended up being in their coalition because there was sort of no option, no way to form a coalition without it. But I could be wrong. But there's several countries in Europe, that are facing similar issues right now, which is when people ask me about like diplomatic pressures, like, is this going to affect Israel's relations with the world? I'm like, well, I don't think Europe has a leg to stand on. So I don't think it's going to affect, it depends where in Europe, but let's
step away from Europe for a second and sort of use that discussion about the Arab Street to move us, sort of tilt the discussion a little bit, because I think there's also a story to be told about the changing relations between Israel and both Arab and African countries, and certainly post-Abraham Accords. But the discussions, the reality continues to change, and I think it'd be interesting for people to hear your perspective and some background on those new relationships or changing relationships.
Sure. Well, I mean, the Abraham Accords were a very exciting moment, and they, happened a little over 2 years ago now. But the groundwork, you could go back, all the way to the founding of the state of Israel, talk about the groundwork for some of these countries. Morocco has had sort of an on and off relationship and a secret relationship with Israel for many years, including and then this is something that was found out much later, but before the 6-Day War, Morocco actually gave information to Israel about what other Arab countries were planning. So some of these relationships go back a really long time. But if we want to talk more recently, the Iran deal, actually, that the Obama administration signed, and of course several other countries, it was between the world powers and Iran, helped bring Israel and some of these Arab countries together, because these Arab countries see Iran as an enemy. And they saw problems with the Iran deal, not as much as Israel did and still does. The Lapid and Bennett government also opposed the Iran deal, even though they went about it in a different way than Netanyahu did. So these countries, when they felt, maybe abandoned is a strong word, but they felt that the US, sort of wasn't working in their interests anymore, they started to, behind the scenes, talk to Israel more about defense issues, sharing intelligence and things like that. And Netanyahu saw this as an opportunity because in the past, these countries all sort of said that we're not going to make advances towards normalization with Israel if there's no advances in peace towards the Palestinians. And that was really, that had been the case in the past. Like after the Oslo Accords, there were a bunch of countries that didn't fully normalize relations with Israel, but had some form. So Morocco had a liaison office. Israel had a trade office in Qatar and Doha. And there were other countries that had lower level relations with Israel that were public and out in the open. And then at different points, whether it was the Second Intifada or the 2008 Gaza war, all of those fell apart. What's dramatic about the Abraham Accords is that countries began to see an advantage in relations with Israel as Israel, not as we're going to do this to encourage Israel to make peace with the Palestinians. And so it began with the United Arab Emirates, and then Bahrain signed on immediately after. And within a few months, the US had convinced Sudan and Morocco to join in. Sudan, sort of the civil war broke out in Sudan really soon after, so it didn't really go anywhere. And so we'll leave them for now. But in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, which were announced in August 2020, the relations with the UAE have really flourished, really major business and defense relations, and with Morocco as well, very good defense relations. Morocco, it might not be as obvious as, say, the UAE, which is a Gulf state, but Morocco has also cut ties with Iran in 2018, I believe it was, because they were Iran was helping the rebels in the Western Sahara that wanted to break away from Morocco. So Morocco also sees Iran as an adversary. And Morocco is also interesting because about 1 million Israelis can trace their roots to Morocco in some way. That was the biggest immigration group coming from of Mizrahi Jews, of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And Israelis had been traveling on trips to see their roots and learn about their roots. And there's a few thousand Jews who still live in Morocco. And so this has been a huge, almost like a family reunion. I mean, I traveled to Morocco to report on it earlier this year. And it's fascinating to see, I've been to other Muslim Arab countries, and they sort of are mostly clueless about I guess they knew there were once Jews in their country, but they have no idea. Whereas in Morocco, they really feel that Jews are a big part of their history, and they know about where the Jewish cemetery is, and they know about where the synagogues were, and they so it's just really fascinating to see that friendly and positive relationship between Moroccans, Moroccan Muslims and Moroccan Jews, and how that's come through and sort of been strengthened by relations between Israel and Morocco. I would say the UAE and Israel have a lot in common in terms of being startup nations. Sort of the UAE is very high tech, or at least Dubai and Abu Dhabi are. And, just a lot of collaboration going on there in the tech scene and in the business scene and things like that. And also Israelis are very excited to visit it because it's like the Las Vegas of the Middle East, not because of gambling, but because this is a very flashy place to visit. So it's become a huge, so many Israelis have visited.
So by the way, maybe there's a human element piece, and certainly most of us on this call are aware of the difference between a warm and a cold piece. So the number of Jews Israelis, as I understand it, visiting Morocco or going to UAE is off the charts, really high penetration rate. But the opposite of UAE folks visiting Israel or Moroccans going to Israel are very, very small numbers. And certainly if we're talking about a population like UAE, that doesn't seem to be about economic limitations to invest the money on a flight there. What are is this speaking about some sort of imbalance in the relationship, or that the government is ahead of where its people are? What's the significance?
So there's a little bit of all of that. In Morocco is definitely, the number of people who can actually afford it is small. But also in Morocco, there is a greater degree of freedom than in the UAE, which for all of the good things about the UAE, they are ranked by Freedom House as one of the least free countries in the world. So in the UAE, you're not going to hear that much criticism of the Abraham Accords, but I think that there's still people who, a lifetime of consuming Arab media that tells you that Jews in Israel are evil doesn't just get erased because the king tells you one day Israel's okay now. And so it's only the like real upper crust people of the UAE who sort of are openly like visiting Israel, loving Israel, whatever. The other people are just going about their day. Like this doesn't make a difference to them. In Morocco, you actually have politics. They have a parliament that's elected. They're not allowed to, you're not allowed to really criticize decisions made by the king, but the king doesn't make all the decisions. And so there's more criticism of ties with Israel and things like that, and it's much more mixed. And again, I went on this Israeli delegation, and basically while we were in the air flying from Israel to Morocco, Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera journalist, was shot and killed in the West Bank. And it was there were certain groups of people and politicians who canceled, who didn't want to be seen meeting with a group of Israelis because they knew that it was like a really unpopular time. But at the same time, as I said, like I overall experienced the trip as a lot of people are showing a lot of warmth towards Israel and towards Jews. So I do think that it is substantively different from, say, Egypt or Jordan, where I have no expectation that Egyptians and Jordanians are going to come visit Israel anytime soon. But it's not, I mean, there's still groundwork to be laid. There's still work to be done to make it, I guess, the mainstream to support Israel.
So let's push this in in another particular avenue, right? And we're certainly aware, many of us, of what's happening with the UN and Palestinian votes against Israel. Do you imagine that there will be any Arab partners who actually would stop voting against Israel at the UN, right? If we're talking about some of this stuff.
The trend so far has been interesting. In the UN General Assembly, they've not changed their votes at all. In Geneva, which is where the UN Human Rights Council is, and also UN Women and Health and a few other things, there have been partnerships. There's been a lot of sort of fruitful partnerships on resolutions and on initiatives and things like that between Israel and Abraham Accord countries in Geneva. But the General Assembly, which is where, like, say, last week, there was a decision, a preliminary vote on a resolution to ask the International Court of Justice to rule on whether the quote unquote occupation is actually illegal annexation. The Abraham Accords countries have voted with the Palestinians on that. So yeah. I think like they're able to work with Israel on like positive initiatives, but they're still sort of supporting the Palestinians when it comes to, their belief that like Israel's presence in the West Bank is not legitimate.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, I guess that's when we think about full normalization, that's an interesting aspect.
Well, I mean, there's so many countries in the world that Israel has relationships with that it goes the same way. I mean, like all of South America, much of Europe, even though the situation's gotten somewhat better in Europe. Yeah. The quote unquote global South like has always voted with the Palestinians.
Yeah, most definitely. I've got an interesting question. Given sort of where this coalition partnership looks like, and again, we're not at November 15th, let alone the full month that that Bibi Netanyahu has to to form a coalition. But where are Israelis' appetite in relationship to Smotrich and Ben Gvir, right? Bibi is going to clearly, will make the coalition with whatever serves his interests. But is there potential of backlash? Where does that lie? Where's the sentiment of Israel versus some of these strong arm or racist or ultra-nationalist forces within Israel?
I think there's a lot of public backlash, but it's coming mostly from the center and the left. the moderate right has sort of disappeared from Israel as a political force. There are some moderate figures within Likud, because Likud is one of the only parties in Israel that actually holds primaries. They have over 100,000 members, and the majority of those members, not all of them, but a majority of them do vote in the primaries, and they choose their representatives in the Knesset, which almost no other party in the Knesset right now has that. I think the only other party is Labor, and they have 4 seats. But so there are some moderates in Likud, but they're not going to undermine Bibi, because that's not going to work politically for them. And so, but you do hear a lot of backlash and a lot of uproar in the center and the right, center and the left in Israel. Interestingly, there was a poll last week that showed that half of the voters for Yesh Atid and for the National Unity Party, what was once known as Blue and White, and those are the two centrist parties. So half of their voters would like those parties to be in a coalition with Netanyahu, because presumably if they were in a coalition with Netanyahu, then Netanyahu wouldn't need Ben-Gvir. However, those parties' leaders say that they refuse to sit with Bibi. So if you're wondering why we had 5 elections in 4 years,
I know. Well, I mean, right. And
refuse to sit with Bibi.
They had made that commitment in earlier cycles, right? That they would not sit with.
Right. And Benny Gantz, our defense minister, though not for much longer, he has broken that commitment in the past, but Netanyahu, let's say, didn't respect him very much in that role, and so he's not going to do it again.
Well, I think at least we know that I don't think Bibi's going to give Smotrich that portfolio. That would be frightening.
I don't know. I'm not so sure the way coalition talks are looking right now, but he doesn't want to give it to Smotrich. He's very hesitant.
Yeah, guy with no real experience in that. So let's see, a couple other questions here. What do you think are some of the likely consequences of the new coalition for LGBTQ issues? Start with that, then I got some follow-ups with that.
So the Religious Zionist Party I mentioned is made up of 3 different parties. So one of the parties is called the Noam Party, and they just have 1 seat in the Knesset. The Noam Party they are the party for normal families. They're a homophobic, misogynist party. However, when their one representative came up to Netanyahu and said that he wants all kinds of things related to the LGBTQ, people in Israel, to be rolled back and changed, Netanyahu said no to all of them. I hope that will continue. I think a lot of the progress that the LGBT people in Israel have made over the years has been sort of through the courts and not so much through legislation. And so unless they do manage to push through, and also it's not necessarily been through the courts in the way of striking laws down, right? Which is that's how they want to reform the courts. So I'm optimistic that things won't change very much. Maybe in terms of like whoever's education minister, there's a chance that they'll maybe try. I'm not even certain like what's taught in schools that has to do with LGBT folks. My kids are 3 and 5, but maybe they would remove some of that material from the education system, or give less, like the education ministry gives funding to youth groups. Maybe they won't give us funding to youth groups that are gay youth groups, but the big things, won't change, I don't think. I'd be very surprised if they do. And for now, Netanyahu has actually said, like, we're not touching that.
Speaking of these expenditures, earlier in our conversation, we had discussed sort of the avachim and the subsidies for yeshivot students at Kolalim for in Torah study and learning. Any changes within the realm of Haredi education or integration into society, impact on the Haredi women? There's a point maybe 10 years ago where there seemed to be greater openness to their increased economic participation in the Haredi world. There were some cooking schools that were opening up that were focused on providing practical skills to Haredi men. Where are we at with that?
So most of those, Haredi women work at almost as high a rate as the general population of women. because so many of the men study full time. They do tend to work fewer hours because the average Haredi family, I think the average is 6.5 children. So, it's a lot of kids to be working full time while your husband's studying full time. But for men, a lot of those initiatives were grassroots. They weren't necessarily government initiatives. They were able to apply for grants and receive funding from the government. And I don't expect that to change necessarily. There's also a stream of Haredi schools that actually get the sort of matriculation certificates that you would get in any other Israeli school. It's a very small amount of schools, but it's a very small number of Haredi schools like that. Basically the whole Shas, all of the Shas schools are like that. So I should say it's not a very small number. What's new is that there are also Ashkenazi schools like that, not just Sephardic schools like that, because culturally the Haredi Sfardim they just tend to be less isolated from Israeli society. The Haredi Ashkenazi party, they're called United Torah Judaism. They see those schools as a threat, and they don't want more funding to go to that. And so this is a small number of schools, but they might be undermined. But I don't see these adult programs. I mean, there's all sorts of like colleges that will have like special classes for Haredim so that they don't have to be like in mixed gender classes, and like you still get a law degree. That has been brought before the Supreme Court also, by the way, but if I remember correctly, the court allowed those classes to continue to take place. So those kinds of things I expect to continue. It's just a slow trickle. It's like a social grassroots thing. It's not, the government can't force that on people.
Okay.
I mean, they could try, but I don't think it would work.
With that. Okay, no, that's useful to give a little bit of the lay of the land and some of the cultural forces. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I have got a little bit of housekeeping at the end. So is there anything you think that we as American Jews should be paying attention to in the aftermath of this election? Are there things we can do to ensure that Jewish identity, as we understand it, is not compromised by some of the potential partners and Orthodox hegemony on power and discussions of who is a Jew?
I think the major Jewish organizations, the Conference of Presidents, the Jewish Federation, they are voicing their concerns. So I would say, support your local Jewish organizations that have a good connection to the Israeli government. I also the what's it called, the Religious Action Committee or something of the Reform movement. Certainly, like Rabbi Rick Jacobs has made his voice heard. He has a bit of a not the greatest relationship with Netanyahu, but other people, again, the Conference of Presidents, Jewish Federation, I think, do have a strong voice, and the support people and sort of emphasize to, I think, like the lay leaderships of these organizations that are going to be talking to Netanyahu in many cases directly, emphasize your concerns to them so that they can pass them on. But I do think, and as someone who speaks to these people sometimes, that they've definitely made their voice heard already.
Great. Well, look, I really want to thank you, Lahav. We've been having a wonderful conversation with Lahav Harkov, a senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post, who has just been sort of filling us in with the background of Israeli elections, the aftermath, coalition formation, Israeli-Arab circumstances, the developing relationships between Arab and African states with Israel, and all of what that bodes for the future. So I want to thank you for this wide-ranging conversation and for taking the time to speak with us and to be with us here for this program sponsored by Israel360 and Stand With Us. Thank you, Randy Kessler, for your work in helping this program get its feet off the ground, and to the full Israel360 committee for tireless effort to, over the last half decade to keep Israel front and center both for the Neve Shalom community, but for Portland as well, where it's really important that we have these conversations and continue to learn. We've got some wonderful upcoming programs. The one on December 4th, we're going to be looking at Israel from the past. I'm very happy. I'll be involved in this program, but we're going to have a food demonstration, food from the Bible and Talmud on December 4th. 12:30 to 3. My partner for that is going to be our Assistant Director of Education, Lonnie Rader. Lonnie has a fantastic background, worked at Chez Panisse, very important restaurant in America, was an instructor at Culinary Institute of America, and has a very deep food background and resume. So I'm really happy to be partnering with her, and I hope that you'll join us for that food demo and lunch that follows. January 22nd, I guess we've got a little bit of a food thing going as the days get shorter. We're going to have Estee's Kitchen, Mediterranean vegan cooking with demo, helping to cook and observe, and she's really quite wonderful. In February, I don't have the dates in front of me, we are going to have Noam Tibon, former 3-star Israeli general, is going to be our scholar in residence this year. And March, we have a Lenoy Yechieli musical program. So lots of really varied takes on what's happening in Israel, Jewish culture, through an Israeli lens. I hope that you'll be able to join us for those future programs. I want to thank you for your continued support and presence at our Israel360 community that we've forged to really increase our knowledge of Israel. Thank you, everyone, for coming.